The JLR interview series.
Okay, so it's Saturday afternoon, coming up to 1:30 p.m. and Jazz London Radio has a interview on Skype today with a drummer, and his name is Josh Feldstein, and he's hails from the United States, and we're here to talk about his group, which is called the Verve Jazz Ensemble. So how are you this morning, your time in the States?
Thank you for having me, Laurie. It's a pleasure to be on Jazz London Radio and to spend a few minutes chatting.
You're welcome. So that's great. So as I say, we're here to talk about your group, which is called the Verve Jazz Ensemble, and I thought it'd be quite interesting to get you on to have a talk about it. So you released a new CD earlier this year. I think it was in the spring, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct, and that was called Night Mode, and that was our sixth album. And we released that to radio in the U.S., and it was very well received. It was our fifth top 10 album out of the first six albums that we released. So we certainly have fans among the radio contingent, both in the U.S. and around the world. And of course, we think tremendously of the Jazz London radio format, and the work that you guys are doing is just phenomenal. And it was really our pleasure to have a chance to say hi and speak a little bit to some of our fan base in the UK.
No, great. That's great. So thank you very much for that. So, so you've done quite a few albums already, and if I'm not mistaken, you started this project in 2006. I don't know, project is probably not the right word because it's ongoing.
Well, actually, we started the group in its current name and iteration, the Verve Jazz Ensemble. I formed it in '06. We were a local performing group in the state of Connecticut in the U.S., and I formed the group really initially, Laurie, because we simply loved to play the kind of music that the Verve record label made so famous in the 1950s and 60s, and really was out of respect and deference to the Verve label at the time that I took on the name of Verve Jazz Ensemble. Now I have to tell you that there was positively no intention or expectation that we'd ever have any kind of a commercial career. We were just a bunch of local guys playing and having a great time. And one thing led to another, and we ended up developing quite a nice following. And after years of performing locally, the economy in the States in the late 2000s started to really tighten up, and the venues started to close. And we said, okay, well, maybe that's the end of the ride for our group, but before we go out, let's record a vanity project. Let's at least create one CD, because we had listeners asking us if we had any CDs, and of course our answer was always no. Sorry, we don't. But before we wrapped up, we figured, okay, let's record one CD, and at least we can hand it off to our kids and say, look what we did. And so anyway, we recorded the album. It's called It's About Time. In 2012, it was released in early 13, and one thing led to another, and the thing hit top 5 on the national charts, and that was the beginning of our recording career, and the band was sort of recreated as a recording group, and we've gone on from there.
Wow, that's fascinating. And just can you tell us about the members of the group, because I wanted to ask you about that. First, if you could just tell us who your group is, please.
The Verve Jazz Ensemble is currently a septet, and the members of the group include Tatum Greenblatt on trumpet and flugelhorn, John Blank on tenor and soprano saxophone, Alexa Tarantino on alto, and she also is a woodwind doubler on flute. Willie Applewhite plays trombone. We have Steve Einerson on piano, and Elias Bailey is our bassist, and I am the drummer and the leader of the group.
See, I was going to ask about, because it's hard in my mind to say. I mean, you're not a big band, but you're not really a small band either. And so, how would you describe, your configuration?
Well,
musically, because I listened to it and at first I thought, oh, I'm listening to big band music here, but then I thought, well, maybe not.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, we're kind of in a zone where we can kind of be big band imposters, Laura. You see, we can play we can play in that little zone right there where people almost think, wow, is this a big band? Well, no.
Yeah.
But the thing that we really enjoy doing is changing the instrumental configuration. So maybe I could take a moment to talk about that, because when we originally created the group, it was a quintet. It was very much a straightforward, hard bop, Latin oriented group that had roots in swing and roots in contemporary, but our bread and butter was really in the hard bop Latin space, the Art Blakey, Horace Silver kind of a sound, and that's still very much our bread and butter. But the group has very much expanded over the past 6 or 7 years as we've continued to play and develop our music and so forth, and now we've reached the point where about half of our music is original and half of it are standards, variety standards. Our orientation towards standards is a whole range of stuff, from what we call big band tunes that we kind of reconfigure to anything to trio and quartet and various configurations of quintet. So what we do is we actually alter the instrumental configuration of many of the tunes on the album. So we expand and we contract. We will have a number of tunes on any given song that are septet tunes that are going to be, kind of these remodeled big band sounds. But we also will play quintet tunes. We'll also play trio tunes. And so one of the reasons that I've sort of configured the group this way is for the reduction, in my opinion, of what I'll call ear fatigue. Because one of the things that I find to be of importance in the presentation of jazz today, because it is not such a commonly accepted art form musically. It's not. Look at in the United States as an example. I don't think more than a couple percent, maybe 2% of the listening audience really would identify themselves as hardcore jazz fans, jazz listeners. And in order to try to broaden the listening base, I find it's very important to vary the configuration of instrumentation so that the first track or the third track or the fifth track don't sound similar from an instrumentation point of view. And by expanding and contracting the instrumentation, the sound really alters, and that helps keep the sound of the music fresh in the listener's ear. And I've just found that is a formula that we've been using that has worked well, and our listeners tend to really enjoy and look forward to.
Oh, well, maybe that would explain then why I was trying to figure out whether it was a big band or whether it was not a big band. That's quite interesting. And do you think that, is that something you guys hit upon yourselves, or is that a formula that you've heard from others used in the past? I mean, that's quite interesting what you just said.
Well, you don't tell anybody, because if
Too late.
this formula gets out, that's really the end of my formula. My trade secrets come. So please keep this between you and me.
Okay,
I would say, and maybe the couple of million listeners. But the thing I want to clarify is that it really kind of evolved out of my own orientation as a listener. Because let's take a step back. As jazz musicians, we're always listening to music. We're always listening to fantastic players. We're always listening to different eras and elements of music to inspire us. And one of the things as a listener that I've always found to be challenging is when you have a wonderful group, but the configuration of the group is unchanged over the course of an album. And I do find that by the second or third cut, even as a professional musician, my ear sometimes gets tired. I find that, it's the same sound. Great soloing, different tempo, different texture, etc., different grooves. But the sound of the group is quite similar from track to track. And I find that leads to some degree of ear fatigue. And I said, okay, well, if we want to appeal to a broader listening audience, especially an audience that may not be steeped in the legacy of jazz and might be newer to the art form, how can we keep it fresh? How can we create a sound that's going to be accessible to the newer listener to this art form? And I just out of necessity is the mother of invention, I determined that let's vary this. And it was an approach that was well received, and we've sort of stuck with it as a trademark Verve Jazz Ensemble, kind of a branding, if you will.
Okay, no, thanks for that. That's a really interesting answer that you've given there. And just thinking about some of the tracks I've heard so far. One track I did like was I think it's called "As Per Request." I think that's the name of the track. And it's got quite a modern feel to it, but also quite traditional sound. So one other question I want to ask you now are you part of a revival of some sort of it's hard to describe. I don't know straight ahead. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but of a jazz from a different era, so to speak, because so much jazz I hear now, I would say the bulk of it, the majority, especially over in Europe, is what you might want to describe as contemporary jazz, and it has different influences and different things that have come in the last 25 years or so. If you mention the ECM sound, I'm sure you'll understand what I mean by that.
Sure.
So, what you guys are doing is kind of delving into the past a bit. I mean, is that something that in America is quite rare, or is it quite normal? What you guys are doing?
I would say that the approach that we're taking is probably a little left of center.
Right.
Right. The idea here is that we're absolutely a contemporary group.
Yeah.
And the components of contemporary interpretation, contemporary playing, contemporary charting, it's absolutely integrated into what we do. But my personal proclivities were always based in, as I said, the kind of the hard bop sound. But I'm also, as a drummer, I was always very much influenced by many of the greats. For example, Buddy Rich, Joe Morello, the Gene Krupa, if you really want to go back to the swing era, Joe Jones, Elvin, Blakey, Max Roach, Philly Joe Jones. I mean, these are some of the drummers that I was deeply influenced by. I had a chance to study briefly with Joe Morello, the great Joe Morello, who of course played with Dave Brubeck.
Yeah.
And I've continued to study my instrument. I've been very fortunate to study with the great John Riley for the past 6 or so years and intensively. And he was a protege, and is a protege of Joe Morello. So, a lot of the roots of my ears go back to those types of players and that era of music. And to be honest, the ability and the feel of some of these players back in the day, Laurie, just unbelievable. And I feel that because that speaks to me personally, it's an important thing for me to rely upon. And I'm fortunate that the musicians in our group and the Verve Jazz Ensemble all hail from a bop, hard bop kind of a core. They love this music too, and believe me, these guys can swing, and they play with all the contemporary groups in the New York area, traveling around the world, touring. Tatum has played with Richard Bona, in 50 countries around the world, as an example. Matt Ostreicher, who wrote Per Your Request, is a pianist. He's also a conductor and music director on Broadway. So, the musicians in the group are phenomenal players with tremendous breadth and depth of music. But when we have a chance to pick what we love, we all sort of resolve back to that bop core, and so we rely upon that. I would say certainly not extensively, but to a reasonable degree in terms of the musical choices we make, soloing styles and structure and so forth. So that perhaps speaks to some of the orientation. But having said that, you mentioned Per Your Request. I had asked Matt, who was our original pianist, Laurie, on our first album. He then went off and he's been very busy on Broadway for the past 5 or 6 years. And I had an opportunity because of timing to say, hey Matt, would you put together an original composition for our last album? And he said, great. So he created this tune, which is sort of a hybrid between funk and Latin, and it was loosely modeled after some of the Horace Silver work in the late 70s that Horace was playing.
Yeah.
And we ended up with a funky Latin thing. So, we're not afraid to go into other spaces, whether it's funk, Latin. We've got a thing that we're working on in our next album, which is going to be recorded in the spring and hopefully released this coming summer in 2020. And we may even get to some reggae jazz. I mean, so we're not afraid to go into some different spaces because it's fun. But the root of the group tends to resolve back down to this bop or hard bop sound.
Okay. What about because you lead a band and you're the drummer? You don't see many jazz bands led by drummers as much as in the past. Will I be right in saying that, or not?
I would agree. I don't think there are many. There are certainly some, that's for sure, but not a lot. It's not an easy seat to be able to maintain because, as a drummer, I'll be very honest, although I can read music and I have some basic understandings of music theory. I played alto saxophone when I was in school too, so I have a background in melodic instruments, not just rhythmic percussive sound. When you're working with musicians who are instrumentalists, their theory and their capabilities usually far exceed the drummers when it comes to musical theory. So it puts the drummer in a bit of a disadvantage in terms of being able to navigate the space. I'm fortunate enough to be able to work with such wonderful musicians so that when we talk about original compositions or arrangements, and I've written a number of my own tunes, I can rely upon my bandmates to take what I give them structurally and evolve it. And so we have this wonderful reciprocal relationship that works very, very well. If not for that, it would be even more difficult for me as a drummer to be able to do the things that I do. So I can rely very heavily on my bandmates because they're such fabulous musicians.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks for that. That's good to hear as well, actually, because I'm a big fan of drummers. I actually interviewed Peter Erskine a few months ago. That was a pleasure. He's one of the greats, one of my favourites. So it's good to get his insights into things.
Mine too. I think that Peter is one of my heroes. I think I have gone through, Laurie, just about every book he's written, line by line, exercise by exercise, and I can say just on the basis of the material that Peter has published, both in written form, YouTube, and so forth, any drummer from any style that studies the work of Peter Erskine will become a much, much better drummer and musician in no time.
Yeah.
So here's my plug for Peter.
Yeah, and he has a great sense of humour as well.
He's a wonderful person.
Okay, so I just want to ask a couple of more things before we wrap up. And firstly, do you ever have any vocals in any of your groups? Do you ever do vocals from time to time? Just out of interest.
Well, do you think we should?
I'm not just asking. Because you have quite a few CDs that you brought out before. I was just wondering if you ever dabbled on vocal front.
We've dabbled, but we've dabbled outside of the studio. Maybe one day we'll find that right voice for the Verve Jazz Ensemble, and it will happen. Up till this point, though, we haven't quite been able to make the connect. I always have my eyes open, though. So, you know, if we've got some really wonderful jazz vocalists in the UK who would like to reach out, I'm always interested in listening.
Okay, well, and what is your website, by the way? So listeners.
Sure, it's verve-jazz.com.
Verve-jazz.com. Okay, and finally, do you guys ever tour Europe? Or have an opportunity?
Well, we're looking forward to that happening sometime soon.
Okay.
Our objective right now is to begin playing a bit more on the university circuit, and part of the challenges that we have is that because of the group's schedule, travel schedule, being able to book even a small tour is challenging. But I will tell you that it's absolutely on our radar, and probably nothing would give us more pleasure than to have a chance to tour UK and all of the EU. We know that the interest in jazz is significant in Europe, and we really look forward to having a chance to meet many of the wonderful listeners on the continent who are interested in jazz. It's a great feeling to know that so many people love jazz in the EU.
Yeah, no, I will go along with that. The music is definitely keeping going and thriving, actually, right now. I think there's a lot of young talent coming out of Europe and the UK. So, yeah, no, that's good. Okay, so that's it from me. So, thanks for very interesting interview this afternoon. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Laurie. It was a pleasure being on the program, and thank you so much for having us. And I look forward to keeping our dialogue going.
Okay, thanks. And hopefully we get to see you play in the near future.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
The JLR interview series.